Hi everybody, I'm glad that you're watching another super fascinating history video. Well, this one will be, surprise surprise, about the Cold War. So stay tuned to hear fascinating facts, wonderful stories and amazing adventures from the past. So Cold War in Asia, here we go. So what will this video be about? First we look back on what we remember. Nuclear bombs, capitalism versus communism and containment. We will also answer some main questions. How did China become communist? Why is Korea divided in North and South? What was the war in Vietnam about? Why was the United States so afraid of Cuba? Who was John F. Kennedy? And what happened during the Cuba crisis? So let's start by looking at what we already know. We have learned about the danger of nuclear bombs. In 1955, the United States and the USSR both had bombs that were 1,000 times stronger than the two that were dropped on Japan. So in case of war, they will be able to destroy the world 7 times. So we also know that capitalism and communism are two complete different ideologies. Remember, capitalism is about making profit, about developing yourself, giving higher rewards to people with certain talents, and also about democracy and voting. Communism is a system in which everybody should be equal and get the same amount of money, same reward, but it also led to dictatorships. And an important word in this part of the chapter is also containment. Remember, it means the United States wanted to stop the spread of communism. Now let's learn about a few countries that became communist, and we will start with China. During World War II, the communists and nationalists fought against Japan. But after World War II, the Chinese fought a civil war. Their communist leader was Mao Zedong. The communists were almost defeated. They were cornered until Mao decided to flee and take 130,000 of his followers to a more safe place in the north. They walked 6,000 kilometers. It is called the Long March. Tens of thousands of people died, but the communists were able to rebuild their forces. Mao eventually won the civil war, and in 1949 he proclaimed the People's Republic of China. The nationalist government fled to Taiwan. This island is still independent, but China doesn't accept it. It says that it is a province. A lot of countries don't accept the independence of Taiwan. Other countries still believe that Taiwan is the real China. Confusing. Well, a few facts about Mao. Mao wrote a little red book, which was filled with his words of wisdom. It was the only book that was sold in China. It was like to indoctrinate the people. Mao's plan to rebuild China was called the Great Leap Forward. In order to make agriculture more profitable, Mao ordered farmers to kill sparrows because they ate grain. But by killing all the sparrows, grasshoppers could eat everything, which led to a terrible famine. Some personal facts about Mao. Mao had difficulties with pooping, so his wife needed to use her fingers to take it out, and Mao didn't brush his teeth. He cleaned them with tea. This is why his mouth was filled with green teeth and rotting gums. Alright, let's go back to some interesting facts. Mao's China was based on agriculture and the common people. His Great Leap Forward had to industrialize the country, but it failed. To get his power back, he started a cultural revolution. He ordered his followers, especially teenagers, to pick up weapons and cleanse the country. History, temples, buildings, books, artwork, it was all destroyed to build a new country. Opponents and educated people, which were his enemies, were killed. Mao is estimated to be the biggest mass murderer after Joseph Stalin. So, China had fallen to communism. Did containment fail? That's a question that the Americans asked themselves. It seemed to look like it because more countries followed. So the spread of communism seemed unstoppable in Asia. Korea was next. Alright, so communist North Korea attacked the South in 1950. It was helped by China and the USSR. The West helped South Korea. Dutch soldiers were also sent, and they fought and some died in North Korea. So let's stop this K-pop music for a moment. This is a lot better. So, at first, North Korea seemed to win. However, General MacArthur launched a counter-attack with tanks, heavy artillery, and infantry. The tables were turned. But then, what happened? Now it looked like the US was going to win, but the Chinese joined with 300,000 soldiers. While General MacArthur didn't want to give up, he called for an extension of the war into China. He wanted the president to drop atomic bombs on several Chinese cities. Well, luckily President Truman rejected the general's request, because imagine how many people would have died. So eventually in 1953 the war ended in a stalemate, and the 38th parallel became the border between North and South Korea. But there is still a lot of tension between North and South Korea and the United States as well. So Kim Jong-un, who is dictator of the North, constantly threatens with nuclear attacks. The border with the South is one of the most heavily defended in the world. They still shoot at each other, sometimes daily. Kim Jong-un is a dictator who brutally kills his opponents. Well, in one of these pictures you see him with basketball player Dennis Rodman. Apparently they are friends. Well, there is so much to say and so many jokes to make about this rocket man. This is how Trump calls Kim Jong-un. You should look up a video in which Trump visits Kim Jong-un and Trump says to the camera, "Could you get a good picture of everybody in which we look nice and thin?" And then the camera moves to the Korean dictator who stares like an idiot. This is so amazing, it could have been from a comedy show. So this is just a summary, so we have to continue with another country, Vietnam. So Korea wasn't the only Asian country to face communism. After World War II, the Vietnamese wanted to become independent. A colonial war between Vietnamese and the French started. It lasted between 1946 and 1954. The French lost the battle of Dien Bien Phu. This is my Vietnamese, it's not very good. And eventually the war in Vietnam ended with a communist victory. So from that moment, the north of the country was led by the communist leader Ho Chi Minh. But remember containment. What do I hear? Is it the sound of helicopters and the smell of napalm in the morning? The United States didn't want Vietnam to become communist, so they sent soldiers to fight against the Viet Cong. The Vietnam War lasted from 1955 until 1975, and it was a terrible war. Both sides committed war crimes. Many movies are made about this war, such as the music that you hear from Apocalypse Now or The Deer Hunter, Good Morning Vietnam, etc. So this war led to a lot of demonstrations all over the world. Millions of people felt that the US was fighting an illegal war. So why was this war so dangerous? And why does it trigger the imagination of movie producers? Well, because this war was scary as hell. The Viet Cong soldiers went into hiding, and the Americans had to face a moist and warm climate with rainy seasons. They had enemies hiding in tunnels and in the forest. They could impossibly see them. They would suddenly attack out of nowhere. There were booby traps everywhere, and the jungle was filled with spiders and snakes. What do you mean you don't know what a snack is? This is a snack, aka a danger noodle. Well, a few years ago I went on a holiday to Southeast Asia, and one of the countries that I visited was Vietnam. And in Vietnam you can do amazing things. For example, rent a scooter and risk your life in the streets of Hanoi, buy local street food, wear an amazing hat, and experience old military equipment. Well, I was lucky enough to shoot with a Kalashnikov. It was just target practicing, but there was a possibility to pay a little bit more so you could shoot at a chicken. Super cruel. But it gets worse, because I was told that if you would pay $200, I could shoot a cow with a rocket launcher. This is insane but true. Well, look at this picture where I'm trying to hide in the ground like a Viet Cong warrior. My face says, best day ever. Well, eventually, after 20 years of fighting, the United States had to give up. The war was expensive and the communists kept on fighting. A lot of people in the United States and Europe were against the war and they protested. So the US soldiers left the country and the South was overrun by communist soldiers. So it is still a communist country today, but you could see a lot of capitalist things, such as shops, fast food restaurants, etc. So one of the last countries that we have to learn about is Cuba. Cuba is an island in the Caribbean. It had a nationalist leader, but in 1956 the communist rebel Fidel Castro took control over Cuba. He was helped by his friend Che Guevara. Che and Fidel got famous for their revolution, their adventures, but also the way they looked. Fidel with his cigar, and Che became a hero for many Westerners who romanticized socialist and communist ideas. So Che Guevara was a murderer, but his face can be seen on flags and t-shirts. That is the last thing he wanted, by the way, because he was against commercialism and personal property. It is said that his wife once bought expensive shoes from Milan, and he threw them in the river because it was against communism. So Fidel Castro died in 2016 when he was 19 years old, but it was said that he survived 638 assassination attempts by the CIA. There's an amazing book in which all these attempts were written down. For example, they used exploding cigars, fungus in his scuba diving suit, explosive in a nice seashell, treachery by a beautiful lover, poison to make his hair fall out, and all those kind of things. I don't know if this is true, but the book seems fascinating. Well, the United States was shocked because the island of Cuba is very close to them. Suddenly, they had a Soviet ally in their backyard. What if Fidel Castro would shoot rockets from Cuba on United States cities? The panic got even worse when United States spies made pictures of a secret USSR base on Cuba in 1962. US President Kennedy had to find a solution to this Cuba crisis. What if the rockets on Cuba could be launched? What if Americans were in danger? John F. Kennedy was a charming and popular president. He fought against racism, supported West Berlin, and solved this Cuba crisis. He was also a womanizer and addicted to drugs and medicine. Well, something you need to know about John F. Kennedy is he was married to Jackie Kennedy. He had a secret affair with Marilyn Monroe, a very famous movie star back then. So, John F. Kennedy, who was President of the United States during the Cuba crisis, responded by sending United States ships to block the USSR ships heading for Cuba. Could they start fighting? A nuclear war seemed terribly close. Well, the world was close to total destruction. Look at this amazing cartoon. You can see Khrushchev from the Soviet Union and Kennedy, who are arm wrestling, and they both have their fingers on the trigger. They are sitting on each other's bombs, and they could blow up if the other would feel endangered. So eventually Khrushchev and Kennedy agreed to back off. A nuclear war is prevented at the last moment. The United States decided to take its missiles from Turkey, and the USSR took the missiles from Cuba. And the leaders agreed to a direct telephone line between Washington and Moscow. This is how they could solve these problems, by just a telephone call instead of sending warships. If you look at this picture, the man on the left is a real-life superhero. On 27th of October 1962, his submarine commander wanted to launch a nuclear missile during this Cuba crisis because he thought that the war had already started. Well, Vasily convinced him not to do it, and he saved the world. Can you imagine? He saved the world. What if a nuclear bomb would have been launched? Then the others would have been responding, and this is scary as hell. You can see that, the world almost came to an end. So this could happen again. Look at all these other moments that I put in this slide. So the Cuba crisis de-escalated, but what happened to Kennedy? Lee Harvey Oswald shot him. President Kennedy was murdered in Dallas in 1963. It is still unknown if Oswald was the real murderer. He was killed a few days after. There are a lot of conspiracy theories about the death of Kennedy. Well, now let's take a look at the world map in 1980. The world looked different now that China, Vietnam, Korea, and Cuba were communist. Would communism spread further? Could capitalism win? We will find out during the next lesson. Thank you for watching, and be safe.